The Stone family was simply on vacation, looking for a peaceful escape. But when the police wrongfully detained them just because of their skin color, a shocking truth was revealed. Watch as they face injustice head-on and fight for what's right. The Stones had been counting down the days for this vacation. The promise of a break from the hectic demands of their lives had been a glimmer of hope during grueling weeks at work. Robert Stone, a dedicated FBI agent, felt a rare thrill as he eased back into his chair on the shaded poolside deck. Anna, his wife, watched the waves with a look of bliss that Robert had almost forgotten she could wear. Leo, their son, splashed with his little sister, Lauren, in the nearby pool, their laughter carrying over the faint sound of the surf. This was the Silver Shore Resort, a paradise stretching along an endless coast of white sand and turquoise waves. The gentle sway of the palm trees and the soothing whispers of the ocean made it feel like nothing could touch them here. Robert closed his eyes, taking in the warmth of the sun, the scent of tropical flowers, the pure joy of being in a place where he was just a husband and father, not an agent on high alert. He turned to Anna, who was reclined with a novel on her lap, a rare sight as she hardly ever had time for herself with her work as a civil rights attorney. She glanced up, smiling at him, a smile so familiar yet tinged with the relief of finally, truly relaxing. But as Robert reached for a cold glass of lemonade, a shadow fell across him. Blinking against the sun, he looked up to see a figure standing stiffly before him. The man was tall, wearing a dark polo emblazoned with the resort's logo and a guarded expression that immediately put Robert on edge. "Excuse me, sir," the guard said, his tone firm. "I need to verify that you're a guest here." Robert blinked, disoriented by the question. He leaned forward, setting down his glass. "Yes, we're in room 306. Is there a problem?" The guard's eyes narrowed slightly, an assessing glint Robert didn't like. "I'll need to confirm that with the front desk. Just stay here." Robert frowned as the guard retreated. This was not his first experience with being under scrutiny, but here, in this place, it felt wrong, like a dark cloud drifting into his carefully crafted oasis. Anna noticed his tension, placing a reassuring hand on his arm. "Just let it go," she murmured. "Let's not ruin this trip on day one." But as the guard returned, this time with a second, bulkier colleague, Robert felt a flicker of unease deepen. The second guard had a no-nonsense air about him, his gaze directed toward Robert as though he'd already made a decision. "Sir, I'm going to need you and your family to leave the pool area while we check your information," he announced, his voice as unyielding as the glare of the sun overhead. Robert's initial irritation shifted into something colder. He held up a hand, trying to keep his tone even. "As I said, we're guests. Room 306. Call the front desk if you need to verify it, but there's no need to clear us out." The guard gave him a dismissive once-over. "It's policy, sir. We've had issues with non-guests using our amenities." Anna, now fully attentive, set her book down. "Are you saying you suspect us of trespassing?" Her voice was polite, but her gaze was steely. A flicker of discomfort crossed the guard's face. He averted his eyes, but his tone remained firm. "It's just a routine check, ma'am." Robert clenched his jaw, feeling the familiar pain of resentment. It was supposed to be routine, but he knew deep down that they wouldn't have questioned him if he looked more like the other families here. His instincts as an agent told him to stay calm, not to escalate. Yet he couldn't shake the growing feeling that something was wrong. But it wasn't until a pair of police officers arrived, accompanied by a third guard, that the situation went from uncomfortable to unbearable. The officer leading the charge, Sergeant Barton, was a towering man with a hard, impassive face. He approached with a sense of authority that demanded immediate compliance. "Mr. Stone, we need to see identification," Barton said in a tone that brooked no argument. Robert felt his breath catch. His eyes darted to his children, who were now watching the scene with growing confusion and fear. Keeping his voice steady, he reached into his pocket, pulling out his FBI badge and holding it up. "I'm Robert Stone, an FBI agent. Here's my identification." The officer barely glanced at the badge before looking back at Robert with a faint sneer. "That's not the kind of ID I need, Mr. Stone. Hand over a government-issued ID or driver's license." Anna rose from her seat, her face contorted with anger. "Are you serious? You have his badge. That's not enough." Sergeant Barton's eyes flicked to her, and for a second, an unsettling smile played on his lips. "Ma'am, I'd advise you to let your husband handle this." Robert placed a hand on Anna's arm, giving her a brief shake of his head. It's all right. Let's not make this any worse. He pulled out his driver's license, handing it over to the officer, but his tone carried a quiet warning. Just know, Sergeant, that I'm cooperating out of respect, not submission. The officer snatched the license, glancing at it with an exaggerated casualness, then handed it back with a cold smirk. Until we get confirmation, I'm going to have to ask you to leave the pool area. Robert's blood ran cold. The humiliation simmered under his skin as he saw his children watching him, their eyes wide with confusion. He leaned down to Leo, putting on a brave smile. Go on, buddy. Take your sister to the side, okay? Leo nodded, grabbing Lauren's hand and guiding her toward a nearby bench. But even as he did, Robert could see the fear in his eyes, the questions forming behind his innocent gaze. Barton's words cut through the air. Now, Mr. Stone, if you'll just put your hands behind your back. The words hit Robert like a punch to the gut. Excuse me. His voice was cold, sharp. I've done nothing to warrant that. The sergeant's smirk widened. You're not in a position to argue, Mr. Stone. Hands behind your back. A tightening knot of rage coiled in Robert's chest. He'd spent years on the other side of these encounters, taking down suspects and criminals. But now, here he was, on the receiving end of that power, and all because he dared to come here with his family, daring to relax in a place that had never truly felt safe for him. Anna's voice was shaking now, her anger like a live wire. You can't do this. My husband is an FBI agent. He's done nothing wrong. Barton turned his gaze to her, his voice dripping with condescension. Ma'am, if you keep interfering, I'll have no choice but to take you in too. Anna's fists clenched, but she stepped back, her eyes blazing with a helpless fury. Robert, this isn't right. You don't have to let them do this. Robert's voice was a low, controlled rumble. I know, Anna. I know. But right now, the best thing I can do for you and the kids is to keep this from escalating. With a look of resolve, he turned back to the officer, holding his hands out. The cold snap of metal against his wrists sent a jolt through him, but he kept his head high, refusing to let the humiliation show. The crowd around them had grown, a sea of curious faces watching as if this was some twisted show. Some had their phones out, recording every moment of his shame, while others watched with a quiet, guilty fascination. No one stepped forward. No one dared to question the scene before them. As he was led away, the last thing he saw was Lauren's tear-streaked face, her small hands clutching Anna's arm as she watched her father being taken, powerless to stop it. As Robert was led down the winding, manicured path from the pool to the resort's back entrance, each step felt like a blow to his pride. He could feel the burn of humiliation settle into his muscles, weighing down his normally confident stance. His mind raced with images of his children, their innocent faces now burdened with confusion and fear. He couldn't stand the thought of them watching him like this, as if he were a criminal. The officers stopped at a small security office at the edge of the property, shoving Robert roughly onto a bench. He could see the two security guards, Jenkins and his colleague, leaning casually against the wall, watching him with barely concealed amusement. They didn't know, and they didn't care, that they'd crossed the line. Meanwhile, Anna held her children close, her mind spinning with fear and anger. Her hands trembled as she stroked Lauren's hair, murmuring reassurances she didn't fully believe. Leo stood by her side, his jaw clenched, his fists balled. She could see the emotions playing across his face, frustration, confusion, and a flicker of something that broke her heart distrust. He was old enough to understand that something was terribly wrong, but too young to make sense of the world's ugliness. Mom, he whispered, his voice choked with anger. Why are they doing this to Dad? He didn't do anything. He's a good guy. He helps people. Anna took a steadying breath, meeting her son's gaze with all the strength she could muster. Leo, sometimes people act on fear or prejudice, and they don't realize the harm they're causing. Your dad is one of the strongest, bravest people I know. He's going to get through this, and so are we. Leo nodded, but his eyes were still filled with questions. Anna felt a pang of guilt and helplessness. She had dedicated her life to fighting for justice, yet here she was, unable to protect her own family. In the security room, Sergeant Barton paced slowly in front of Robert, who remained seated, his hands still cuffed, his face impassive. Barton stopped in front of him, leaning in close enough that Robert could see the smug gleam in his eyes. You know, Agent Stone, Barton sneered, I don't know what you think you're trying to prove here. You come in, flaunt a badge that could just as easily be a prop, and expect us to roll out the red carpet. Robert looked up, his gaze steely, his voice a low, controlled rumble. You've made a mistake, Sergeant. When you realize it, you will wish you hadn't let your ego run the show. Barton laughed, a sharp, mocking sound that echoed in the small room. Is that a threat, Agent? Because let me tell you, threats don't look good on a man in cuffs. Robert forced himself to remain calm, though anger simmered beneath his exterior. He'd seen men like Barton before, men who thrived on control, who wore their authority like a weapon and used it against anyone who dared to challenge them. Outside the room, Anna couldn't bear the silence any longer. She held Lauren's hand tightly, her eyes narrowing as she approached the front desk, demanding to speak to the resort manager. The receptionist stammered nervously, clearly unsettled by the commotion, but after a brief exchange, she called for Mr. Finch, the resort's manager. A few moments later, Finch, a tall, polished man in a crisp suit, approached, his face arranged into a mask of concern. Ma'am, I understand there's been some unfortunate misunderstandings. I assure you, we're handling the matter with the utmost care. Anna turned on him, her voice low and deadly. Misunderstandings? My husband is an FBI agent, and he's being treated like a criminal. Your staff singled us out, harassed us in front of our children, and now they're dragging him around like he's dangerous. Is this your idea of utmost care? Finch shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the onlookers gathering nearby. Ma'am, please keep your voice down. This isn't a place for. Anna stepped closer, her eyes blazing. I don't care about the place, Mr. Finch. I care about my family's safety. And right now, I'm one phone call away from turning this resort's reputation into a headline no one will forget. The manager's face paled slightly. I assure you, we'll investigate this thoroughly. We pride ourselves on providing a safe and welcoming environment. Then start by treating my husband and my family with respect, Anna snapped. I want him released immediately, and I want answers. If you don't handle this now, I will. And I promise you, you won't like the outcome. Finch's shoulders sagged, realizing he had no choice. He nodded stiffly, muttering something to a nearby employee before rushing toward the security office. Inside, Robert had finally been freed from the cuffs, though his wrists still tingled from the cold bite of metal. The guards and officers had retreated to the far side of the room, speaking in hushed tones with Mr. Finch. The look on their faces was no longer one of smug amusement. It was one of growing dread as the gravity of their mistake set in. Finch approached Robert, clearing his throat awkwardly. Mr. Stone, I apologize for this incident. There appears to have been a miscommunication. Robert met Finch's gaze, his expression hard as granite. Miscommunication? You publicly humiliated me, terrorized my family, and traumatized my children, all over a baseless assumption. Finch stammered, his face red. I understand your frustration, Mr. Stone. I assure you, we'll handle this situation with all the seriousness it deserves. The officers will be reprimanded, and the guards. Reprimands aren't enough, Robert interrupted, his voice cold and unyielding. I want accountability. I want an apology, not just from you, but from each of the people who stood by and let this happen. And I want a public acknowledgement of your mistake in front of my family, so my children know that this behavior won't be tolerated. The sergeant looked ready to protest, but a single look from Finch silenced him. Slowly, reluctantly, each officer and guard approached Robert, muttering a curt apology, their faces a mixture of resentment and shame. Robert stood tall, his gaze unwavering as he held each of them accountable. Outside, Anna watched as Robert reemerged, his head held high, though she could see the weariness in his eyes. He walked over to Leo and Lauren, kneeling down beside them. He placed a hand on each of their shoulders, his voice soft and steady. I'm okay, kids. It was just a misunderstanding, he said, forcing a smile. But I want you to know that we don't let people treat us this way. No one gets to make us feel like we don't belong. And if they try, we stand up and make sure they know we're not afraid. Lauren hugged him tightly, her small arms wrapped around his neck. Leo looked at him with wide eyes, a mixture of admiration and lingering confusion. But Dad, why did they do it? Why didn't they believe you? Robert's heart clenched. He met his son's gaze, searching for the right words. Sometimes, people judge others based on things they don't understand. But that's their mistake, not ours. And we can't let their mistakes define who we are. Max nodded slowly, as if processing his father's words, though Robert knew the memory of this day would linger. He glanced at Anna, who gave him a small nod of encouragement. This fight wasn't over, but together, they'd get through it. Later that evening, after the Stones had returned to their room, a knock sounded at the door. Robert opened it to find Mr. Finch standing in the hallway, his expression remorseful. "Mr. Stone, I wanted to speak with you personally," Finch said, his voice subdued. "I realize words can't undo what happened today, but please accept our apologies. We're offering your family a full reimbursement for your stay, and we'll be taking steps to ensure this never happens again." Robert nodded, his gaze impassive. "I appreciate the gesture, but I'm not here for compensation, Mr. Finch. I'm here to make sure you understand that this isn't just about an apology. This is about respect, about dignity, and about making sure my children feel safe wherever they go." Finch nodded slowly, looking genuinely chastened. "You're right, and I intend to make things right. I'm deeply sorry, Mr. Stone. If there's anything else we can do—" "There is," Anna interjected, stepping forward. "I want this entire incident documented. I want a formal apology issued to my husband and our family. And I want assurances that you'll implement policies to prevent profiling and discrimination on your grounds." Finch swallowed, nodding quickly. "Of course. I'll draft a statement and provide a copy to you by tomorrow morning." Anna's gaze softened, but her resolve remained unyielding. "Good. And understand this. We won't be silent about what happened here. People deserve to know what goes on behind closed doors, especially when those doors are supposed to offer a safe haven." Finch nodded, his face pale. He turned and left, leaving the Stones standing in the doorway, a silent promise of accountability hanging in the air. That night, as the family gathered in their suite, they shared a quiet, determined sense of unity. They'd faced humiliation, fear, and anger, but they had also found strength in each other. Robert held his family close, knowing that while today had scarred them, it had also bound them together in a way that would never be broken. Together, the Stones would continue their fight, not just for themselves, but for everyone who'd been wronged, who'd been silenced, and who'd been made to feel they didn't belong. And with every step, they would make sure the world knew they would not back down, they would not be silent, and they would not be ignored.